What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Terence Crawford, 37 wins, 0 losses, defending his WBO welterweight title against Shawn Porter, 31 wins, 3 losses, and 1 draw. This fight is taking place on November 20th, and this is pretty much the long-awaited Terence Crawford fight against a PBC elite welterweight. This is seen as easily the best opponent for the person who most people consider a top 3 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport, Terence Crawford. And it's crazy to think that he's been fighting for as long as he has. I remember watching him at lightweight fighting the likes of Breedis Prescott. And you know, some people who elevate to pound-for-pound status, they come into the professional ranks with the expectation, yeah, this person is going to be outstanding or has like all-time potential. You know, Terence Crawford was widely respected, and those who knew that he was really good. But his build to relative boxing stardom was kind of a slow burn. Like, he went through several 135-pound fights, a lightweight, and he won a WBO lightweight title against Ricky Burns, defended it against former featherweight champion Yuriorkis Gamboa. So he had a total of 2 title defenses after winning the lightweight belt. His other was against Ray Beltran. That Gamboa fight, by the way, you know, that really tested Crawford. This was seen as like a showdown because Gamboa was past his prime and was 2 weight classes above where he was at his best, but it was seen as Terence Crawford's biggest step up at the time. Terence Crawford actually got hurt during that fight, came back and finished Gamboa in the 9th round. And so he then defended again against Ray Beltran. Then he moves to 140, where he famously unified all 4 major belts in the division. And while that is an extraordinary accomplishment, I mean, there have only been a few people who've done it, like in the past 10 years, for instance. Like, you can name them. It was Crawford, Alexander Usyk, most recently Canelo Alvarez, and Josh Taylor just before that. But when you look at who Terence Crawford beat to collect all 4 belts, and I don't want to diminish this accomplishment, but he won his first belt in his 140-pound debut against Thomas Delorme. You know, the same Thomas Delorme who just got finished in the 1st round against Jaron Boots Ennis. I mean, yes, it was Delorme a few years later. I mean, we're talking 2015 when Delorme fought Crawford, and 2021 when he fought Boots Ennis. But that's who Crawford won his first 140-pound title against. He defends that twice against Thierry Jean and Hank Lundy. I mean, come on. But then he defends his belt against Victor Postol, who I think is probably his most credible opponent to date prior to this Shawn Porter matchup, where Victor Postol was still in his prime, undefeated, holding a belt himself, had just beaten, you know, scary guy Lucas Matisse, stopped Lucas Matisse. So Terence Crawford versus Victor Postol is a fight that carried some danger with it. Victor Postol's no joke, competitive with just about anybody. I mean, he's been competitive with Josh Taylor and Jose Ramirez since this Terence Crawford fight. But Terence Crawford pretty much dominated Victor Postol, winning unanimous decision, capturing the WBC and the unofficial but very credible Ring 140-pound title. So now he's got 2 of the belts in the weight class, defends those twice against John Molina Jr. and Felix Diaz, winning both of those fights by stoppage. And then he fights Julius Ndongo, who actually held the WBA and the IBF titles and was defending those against Terence Crawford, who again holds the other 2 belts. And Terence Crawford dispatches Julius Ndongo, knocks him out in the 3rd round. Now he's holding all of the belts at 140. So he did become undisputed in the division, but it's not like he was fighting a series of great or even very good fighters on the way to capturing all 4. Again, Victor Postol was the best out of the bunch, And Terence Crawford did what he had to do, and at this point, he's still undefeated. So after unifying all 4 titles, he then goes up to 147, where I think he's had his most remarkable success. Again, he held the belt at 135, captured all the belts at 140, but the fact that he has stopped all of his 147-pound opponents, that's pretty remarkable. Usually when people continue to go up in weight classes, you start seeing them winning a lot of their fights via unanimous decision, especially if they're fighting upper tier, near elite or elite fighters. You start seeing a lot more decision wins, whereas in most great careers, you'll see the first half of their career is a bunch of KOs and TKOs because you're fighting against lesser competition on your way to elite or near elite status. But Terence Crawford, after turning 30 and going to a new weight class, has been finishing all of his opponents at 147. Now, those opponents have either been not quite elite, just under elite, or formerly elite and past their prime. Jeff Horn had that famous controversial decision win against Manny Pacquiao, got TKO'd in the 9th. That was impressive. That was Terence Crawford's debut. It's damn, he finished Jeff Horn. And Jeff Horn's obviously been finished since that. I mean, he was never the same really after that fight. Or, he might have even been damaged from that Manny Pacquiao showdown. But, yeah, Jeff Horn's seen his best days. But at the time, this stoppage win over Horn for Terence Crawford was very impressive. And then he beats Jose Benavidez Jr., who he was having some difficulty with. Benavidez Jr. had been shot in the leg and hasn't had or recovered 100% ability in his leg since the shooting. But he fought Terence Crawford pretty competitively. He started showing some of his injuries late in the fight, and he got stopped in the 12th against Crawford. Then Crawford fights former elite fighter Amir Khan way past his prime, stops him in his 6th. It was a low blow that Amir Khan kind of refused to come back into the fight from, and the fight was stopped. 6-round TKO. Many thought that Khan was kind of looking for a way out. I thought that the fight was going to be a lot more competitive because Amir Khan flashes, some of the fastest hand speed of his generation. But, in most fights that Khan has fought against 147, and certainly when he fought Canelo at 154, he's been kind of out of his depths in the recent fights of his career. 140, he was as good as they come. And, he had flashes of greatness at 147, like his dominant win over Devin Alexander. Super impressive. But, yeah, this wasn't Amir Khan's best showing. But, again, another quality, but, kind of a win for Crawford that you have to, notate as, but, past his prime Amir Khan. And then his next fight was against Mean Machine Kavaliauskas, which is a win that aged well. We recently saw Virgil Ortiz Jr. stop Kavaliauskas, but Kavaliauskas, hurt Terence Crawford in that fight. Terence Crawford, kind of kicked it into high gear, picked up his volume, and is, just devastating and skilled, tactical, sharp, power punching. Finished Kavaliauskas in the 9th. And, some people look at that as being a super credible win. And it is a good win, but it's there's certain guys that you beat where over time the guy starts to develop a rep, or he overachieves or exceeds expectations against you being Terence Crawford, to where you kind of build your name on that. It's Mean Machine's really a guy. Like when Nakatani overperformed against Teofimo Lopez. It's that he's got that win over Nakatani. But, going into the fight, people weren't really, Nakatani wasn't on people's radar. Mean Machine, people didn't really think was the guy that we want to see Terence Crawford fighting, but he was a respectable name and somebody who we don't quite know what his true upside is. Now we might have a better idea, but yeah, Crawford battled back from adversity in that one, gets a stoppage over Kavaliauskas, and then he fights Kell Brook, and that's his latest fight to date. Kell Brook actually beat an undefeated Shawn Porter, former IBF champ, who I feel kind of ruined his career by choosing to go up 2 weight classes to fight the scariest guy 2 weight classes up, Triple G. Gennady Golovkin fought a spirited few rounds before breaking his orbital bone and eventually getting stopped, then having to come back down 2 weight classes back to 147 within several months to defend the IBF title against an emerging, at the time, Errol Spence Jr., just a tall order and a hell of a 2-fight schedule for Kell Brook that I don't think his career ever recovered from. Unfortunate. Like, there was a time in the welterweight division, and we're going to get into this, where, Kell Brook and Keith Thurman were seen as the, two best fighters in the division in this, we'll call it the post-Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao era. I mean, Pacquiao was still around, but at the time he was, fighting Marquez a fourth time, fighting Timothy Bradley a second and third time, fighting Jeff Horn. So Keith Thurman and Kell Brook really emerged as the champions in the division. Of course, Errol Spence was bubbling underneath. This was when people weren't really giving or wanting to give Errol Spence a shot, same way that they're not really going to be rushing to give Virgil Ortiz Jr. or Jerron Boots Ennis a shot. But yeah, Kell Brook used to be a great fighter, I thought. Like, I would have loved to have, you have those mythical matchups like What If. But yeah, Kell Brook fought Terence Crawford. I thought he won the first couple rounds. Third round, Terence Crawford switched to southpaw, which he often does. He'll fight a couple rounds orthodox. Usually will kind of battle evenly with the opponent, where you're like, yeah, I don't really see the magic. But then when he switches to southpaw, you start seeing him connect with many more of his power punches and kind of taking control of the fight by like the third, fourth, fifth round. But, Kell Brook had a good start. Some people thought he would. He has fast hands. He's got very sharp punches. But Terence Crawford, after switching to southpaw, hit him with like a lead jab hand. Because when you switch, now your right hand is your jab hand. And it was kind of like an off rhythm. Not an extraordinarily devastating looking punch, but because of the angle, because of Kell Brook's lack of awareness of the angle and of the punch coming, it just kind of caught him like in the side of the eye, side of the head, to where Kell Brook staggers badly into the ropes and is finished like moments later. It was one of the more bizarre stoppages I've seen. I'm not calling any sort of a dive or anything. I believe it was legit. It's just like, damn, like, what kind of a tool out of the utility belt of Terence Crawford did he pull that type of timing on that lead right hand punch? You just don't see that type of stoppage of elite or near elite fighters. And, maybe Kell Brook was looking for a way out, but I gave Kell Brook the benefit of the doubt, thinking, nah, that punch landed cleanly, and it was just one that he didn't see that Terence Crawford was kind of setting up. And again, when you switch stances, it usually takes it takes you some time to get adjusted to your opponent. Now you've got a different defensive frame, so you got to account for that. But more importantly, your opponent now has to do the calculus in your angles as you adjusted. Now you've got a straight right hand coming, and obviously for Terence Crawford, he's got the right jab and that kind of turn the hand over and make it like a jab, slightly a hook type of a punch. That's what he basically finished Kell Brook off with. Super impressive, and it just kind of added to the lore of, yeah, Terence Crawford makes adjustments. Yeah, Terence Crawford does it all. He's a high IQ fighter. All these things that we attribute to Terence Crawford. Now, one thing I'll say about Crawford is that he's not really a hit and not get hit guy. He gets hit more than the true sweet science guys that we've seen over the years. He's not Pernell Whitaker, Floyd Mayweather. You get me? Well, now he's going to be fighting Shawn Porter. It's like, when Terence Crawford was working up the 135, 140, PBC and, at the time, like HBO for some time, Showtime for some time, they already had the welterweight division popping, right? You had Keith Thurman, you had Shawn Porter, you had Kell Brook, you still had Manny Pacquiao sticking around, and you had the emerging Errol Spence Jr. You had a lot of guys who were making a lot of noise, champions. Keith Thurman famously had the showdown with Shawn Porter, razor thin decision, which is another trademark or hallmark of this 147-pound class in recent years. Usually when you get the elite fighting the elite, you have a lot of 115 to 113 split decision scorecards. That's whether you're talking Keith Thurman versus Shawn Porter, Keith Thurman versus Danny Garcia, Shawn Porter versus Danny Garcia, and Errol Spence versus Shawn Porter. Shawn Porter is a former IBF champ. Like, he really kind of had his coming out party. He had a draw against Julio Diaz. He then avenged that draw with a unanimous decision over Diaz. Then he fights Devin Alexander for the IBF belt. By the way, Tim Bradley was another one of those 147 guys that you need to mention in that era. He was just so tied up in those Pacquiao fights, and I think that he had gotten paid so well in those Pacquiao fights that, he retired after his loss to Pacquiao in their third fight where we never got to see him mix it up with that next elite tier of 147-pound welterweight. But Shawn Porter fights Devin Alexander for the IBF title. He wins that via unanimous decision. He actually knocked Devin Alexander down in that fight, and he just looked like a terror. Like, he was just coming, throwing just mean combinations. I mean, he's built like a bulldog, like a little running back. In fact, early in Shawn Porter's career, he fought at way higher weight classes than where he's been in the relevant part of his professional boxing career. But it really put him on the map when he beat Devin Alexander, because we all knew Devin Alexander, and now we knew Shawn Porter. Well, following that up, even more spectacularly, was his fight against Paulie Malignaggi, where he actually stopped Malignaggi in the fourth. And in that fight, he looked like he might be the next coming of Mike Tyson. Like, the way that he looked like he was able to, like, hit you from halfway across the ring with how he was kind of lunging into his crouch low, explode high power punches. Like, Paulie Malignaggi was not seeing the range and the angles. He must have thought he was out of harm's way, because he was getting cracked by Shawn Porter, dropped multiple times. He just got devastated, vanquished in that fight. Shawn Porter was looking like he is the class of the division by that time, with that successful title defense against Malignaggi. And then he fights Kell Brook, and Kell Brook outboxes Shawn Porter. Like, that was kind of an eye-opener. I came into that fight like, come on, Shawn. Like, because Shawn, like I said, I cannot understate or overstate how impressive that title defense against Paulie Malignaggi, aging Malignaggi, but still, Paulie Malignaggi, somebody who you usually got to go several rounds with. He's a very high IQ, sweet science fighter. Shawn Porter was having none of it. Stopped him quickly. But then he fights Kell Brook, and Kell Brook just outclasses Shawn Porter, wins by a couple rounds. It was a majority decision win, so it was still a very close and competitive fight, but Kell Brook was just moving well, moving out of the harm's way of Shawn Porter's most devastating power punches. He was just, beating him to the punch, clinching a lot to keep Porter from really fighting effectively on the inside. We know how Shawn Porter likes to let his hands go when he's in close quarters. I mean, he'll throw combinations, he'll ambush, he'll do a lot of different things to get the edge. And, Kell Brook beat Shawn Porter about as cleanly as anybody I've ever seen beat Shawn Porter, including Errol Spence Jr. Like, Kell Brook might have won by a couple rounds. I'm watching the fight thinking, yeah, I think Kell Brook edged that maybe like 8 rounds to 4. Whereas I think that the knockdown against Errol Spence Jr. was the difference in their fight. Like, that one going into the 11th round could have gone either way. And even as it was a split decision win for Errol Spence Jr. So nobody smokes Shawn Porter, including Kell Brook. Well, after that loss to Brook, he fights Eric Bonet. Then he beats Adrian Broner via unanimous decision. Then Shawn Porter challenges for the title again, but this time it's the WBA belt. The belt holder at this time is Keith Thurman, and they fight this was a great fight, man. Like, people need to rewatch that one. Like, and just rewatching and look at how well Keith Thurman used to move. Like, it's unfortunate that the last 3-4 years of Thurman's career have gone the way that they have, because Keith Thurman was a high quality fighter. Like, he would be a prime Keith Thurman would be about as good as anybody at welterweight right now. I truly believe that. Well, Keith Thurman edged Shawn Porter in a war, like a tactical war. They were both imposing their game plan. Keith Thurman was kind of like the stick and move, sharpshooting, precise puncher. Shawn Porter's kind of trying to jump into the pocket and crowd Keith Thurman, letting his hands go, working him over with combinations, and both of them were having their moments. It was very, very interesting. Keith Thurman retains his WBA title. Shawn Porter falls just short once again. And, there's something to be said about the narrative of Shawn Porter. For as good as he is, and as game as he is, and as consistent as he is, and as, competitive as he is against anybody, he's kind of, even though he's become a 2-time champ, and we'll get to the second time he captured the belt. I told you about capturing the IBF belt, but 2-time champ, still seen somewhat as a bridesmaid, never the bride of the welterweight division. Like, his truest moment was when he had beaten Devin Alexander to capture the belt, and then looked like that against Paulie. And then, later on, after losing to Keith Thurman, he beats Danny Garcia 3 fights later after beating Andre Berto in like a war, an ugly war, headbutts, like all kinds of stuff. It was nasty. Andre Berto was not having a good time in there against Shawn Porter. It was a 9th round TKO stoppage. Then Porter fights Adrian Granados, beats him. Competitive fight. This was like a much better Adrian Granados than we just saw fighting Conor Benn. I don't know who that Adrian Granados was, but this Adrian Granados was closer to the Adrian Granados that fought Adrian Broner, a super close fight, where that one could have gone either way between Granados and Adrian Broner. Granados lost to Shawn Porter via unanimous decision, competitive fight, and then Shawn Porter fights Danny Garcia for the vacant WBC belt, and Shawn Porter wins that. So that's how he captures the title for the second time. This time it's the WBC belt against Danny Garcia in a very good fight. Danny Garcia fought Keith Thurman super competitively. He fought Shawn Porter super competitively. He fought Errol Spence a little less competitively. I felt like Errol Spence is the one who really put his stamp on the win against Danny Garcia. The Keith Thurman Garcia and Shawn Porter Garcia, yeah, I thought that both of them should have won like 7 out of the 12 rounds, like 7-5 or maybe 8-4, but they were all really close fights. Shawn Porter's champion once again, but again, there's this narrative that Shawn Porter is always the bridesmaid, not quite the bride. Never the guy, never the number one, truly number one guy in the division, at least up until this point. Well, after beating Garcia for the title, he fights Yordenis Ugas, who obviously his name's grown dramatically since, most recently in that very impressive decision win against a now retired Manny Pacquiao. But when Shawn Porter fought Yordenis Ugas, I thought Ugas deserved that fight. Like, I thought that it was very close. I thought, we talk about people edging these fights. I thought Ugas deserved the edge against Shawn Porter when they fought. Well, Shawn Porter was awarded the split decision win over Yordenis Ugas. But this fight, those who knew that Ugas was a good fighter, but this one really put Ugas on the map because Ugas kind of became the guy who we kind of saw with our eyes possibly beat Shawn Porter. But Shawn Porter then fights the title unification fight, his WBC against Errol Spence Jr., bringing in the IBF title. And Errol Spence Jr., like I said, beats Porter via split decision. And I, again, thought that the difference was that late fight knockdown. Brutal knockdown for Errol Spence Jr. Props to Shawn Porter for getting up from that one because he got blasted. And you know what? Since Shawn Porter hit the scene, because of his fighting style, I always thought that the writing was on the wall, that somebody was going to catch him and stop him. I thought the same thing about Timothy Bradley, and it never ended up happening. I mean, he got dramatically hurt. He got dropped a few times against Pacquiao in their third fight, but, and then against Ruslan Provodnikov, a fight of the year fight. Like, that was like an all-timer. That was an absolute war. But Timothy Bradley, he won that fight. He dug in there and won that fight. Brutal fight. He got leveled in that first round. Just watch the first round against him versus Provodnikov. Damn. And he got hurt late in the fight against Jesse Vargas, where they actually knocked 10 seconds off of the final round of that fight, where if there were 10 more seconds on the clock, Timothy Bradley might have gotten finished against Jesse Vargas. Timothy Bradley came out with the win again. But Timothy Bradley, like Shawn Porter, these are guys who I thought that they're out there to get hit a little too much. I mean, sometimes they'll mind their P's and Q's. Like we saw Shawn Porter, I thought, box brilliantly against Danny Garcia. You've got to box well against Garcia to not get hit by that mad hook. Left hook of Garcia's. So I thought he did a little more boxing from the outside against Garcia, but he just has been so inclined to jump into the pocket and ambush that I'm like, damn, a sharpshooter's got to like really do something with that to make him pay for that and to exploit that, right? But it hasn't really caught up to him yet. He hasn't paid for it truly, Shawn Porter. Neither had Timothy Bradley. But, he came really close to paying for it with that uppercut against Errol Spence Jr. So Shawn Porter's had one fight since against Sebastian Formella, and now he's fighting Terence Crawford, who many believe is going to be that guy to finally finish Shawn Porter. And Shawn Porter is so damn amazing. The fact that he's been able to be so durable, which is why I think that this is going to be way more competitive than I think a lot of people who are rightfully super impressed by Terence Crawford and, they think that he's going to beat Porter. Many think he's going to stop Shawn Porter. I'm almost thinking that in order for Crawford to beat Porter, he might have to stop Shawn Porter because I don't see him winning 9 rounds to 3 or 10 rounds to 2. This is going to be a very close fight. Like, I kind of think Shawn Porter might win more of the rounds that nobody gets dropped. Like, you're not going to out-volume Shawn Porter. He's going to be in your chest. He's going to be throwing punches, landing punches. He does kind of smother his shots to where that Devin Alexander and then Paulie Malignaggi showcases for Shawn Porter, it didn't seem to hold. I thought early that he was a much more devastating puncher than he's turned out to be. He's a good puncher, not a great puncher. He looks the part, but it just doesn't translate into the impact that you're having on the opponent. But again, he's able to fight evenly at worst against elite fighters with this style. And I mean, there have been several Shawn Porter fights that I'm watching the fight and I look at the first 2 rounds and I'm like, yeah, there's no way he's going to be able to keep this pace up. He might be in trouble here. And he ends up keeping that pace for the whole fight. And it's like, damn, like, when is this, like, eternal gas tank, this eternal durability, this just keep on throwing punches from round 1 to round 12, when is this going to end for Shawn Porter? And again, many people think that this is where Shawn Porter finally meets a stoppage against Terence Crawford because he is such a sharpshooter, because he makes that stance switch and starts throwing punches from other angles and at off times, trying to catch opponents off rhythm where they don't really see it, where they're walking into the punch, setting traps and all that stuff. Like front foot, back foot. He's one of those Swiss Army knives who could do it all. Richard Dwyer, online boxing analyst, dives into a lot of that stuff stylistically. And what do I expect to see between Terence Crawford and Shawn Porter? Again, I'm not on the same page as a lot of people I'm hearing that think that it's not a foregone conclusion, but that it's most likely that Terence Crawford gets a stoppage win over Shawn Porter. And I'm like, what precedent do we have to really back that up? I mean, it's possible. And if somebody was, able to do it, it would be somebody like Terence Crawford. I'm just saying, I haven't seen. If Shawn Porter is still as motivated as he's been throughout his career and is as prepared for this fight, I mean, he's 34 years old. Both of these guys are 34 years old, but I have no reason to believe that Shawn Porter is going to under-prepare for, arguably the biggest fight of his life, especially because, he's got to be somewhat tired of the narrative, having lost those 115, 113, been on the short end of the stick on some of those scorecards in some big fights, like the one against Keith Thurman, like the one against Errol Spence Jr. I'm sure he would love to kind of rectify and redeem, go from the bridesmaid to the bride of the division by beating Terence Crawford. Not coming in a close second, you know what I mean? And Terence Crawford, I was saying, the party had been going on at welterweight while Terence Crawford was working up the rankings. Well, at the time he got to 147, we're like, oh man, this is going to be really interesting. But it's like, damn, that was like 3 years ago now. And he's been fighting all these guys who they've been trying to keep him busy on the top ranked side because PBC has all the talent, basically 90% of the talent at welterweight. So it's like they couldn't even get any good fights for Terence Crawford. And I mean good meaning like the best type of fight that you could ask for in the division. They were trying to think maybe a Manny Pacquiao showdown could work out since Manny Pacquiao was kind of a free agent. But, Terence Crawford, we thought, oh man, we're going to get to see Terence Crawford mix it up with the Keith Thurmans, the this and the that. And nah, none of that. But this is the first window for Terence Crawford into the PBC stable on what could be his last fight with Top Rank. So the stakes are high in this one. And I mean, for Shawn Porter to play spoiler in this Terence Crawford party, because Terence Crawford's the A side. He's the belt holder and he's the pound for pound elite. He's kind of seen to be the boogeyman still of the division. I mean, even as experienced and as long as he's been around, still a boogeyman. But yeah, because PBC's been so insular and has kind of been its own island in how they operate in this welterweight division. Well, again, this kind of shatters all that. Now we've got Terence Crawford versus Shawn Porter. I actually think Shawn Porter is going to win majority of the rounds, at least to my eyes. I think Terence Crawford is going to, look, if he's going to drop Shawn Porter, I could kind of see it possibly being like an uppercut or something, catching Shawn Porter naked somehow, like where his chin is a little over his heels as he's coming in for some of those lunges. Like, Terence Crawford could definitely do that, but I just think that round over round, Terence Crawford might start falling behind on scorecards because of Shawn Porter's just 36 minutes of tenacity. Like, you know, if you're going to be fighting Shawn Porter, you got to pack a lunch. And I don't think Terence Crawford is as good at Keith Thurman's style of hit and not get hit, sweet science, you know, boxer puncher type of boxing. I don't think Terence Crawford could out Thurman. I don't think he's as, you know, trap you and make you pay and just stay in the trenches and go to the body, go up high, work behind the long jab, and then just mix it up as Errol Spence. I don't think Crawford outspences Spence, but he's got his own unique set of tools. And, you know, one of his, like, physical gifts is the fact that he has a 74-inch reach. And to put that into perspective, you know, Floyd Mayweather, 72-inch reach. Errol Spence Jr., 72-inch reach. Terence Crawford, 74-inch reach? Really? Yeah. So, you know, there could be some things that he could do in that regard because, you know, Shawn Porter is not a tall fighter. I mean, Terence Crawford isn't particularly tall. He's like 5'8", but Shawn Porter is what, 5'7". Okay, so it's only a 1-inch height advantage, but it's a 74-inch reach to a 69.5-inch reach advantage for Terence Crawford. Now, this hasn't mattered much in the career of Shawn Porter. Now, granted, Kell Brook doesn't have the reach of Terence Crawford. Thurman didn't have the reach of Terence Crawford, nowhere near the reach of Terence Crawford. And Errol Spence was just shy of Terence Crawford's reach. But again, Shawn Porter is able to make up for that by having some of the best legs in the division, in boxing, really. When you think about how he's able to jump in and out of the pocket and how he's been able to swim without getting wet to a degree. I mean, he gets hit, but not by the guy's best stuff, usually because he is moving his head from round 1 to 12. He is moving his feet from round 1 to 12, and he's damn sure moving his hands from rounds 1 through 12. So I actually think Shawn Porter is going to get majority of the rounds here. The question is, can Terence Crawford drop Porter? It doesn't have to stop Porter, but if you drop Porter once or twice, that starts to neutralize any sort of round advantage that or round lead that Porter might be building up. So does Crawford drop Shawn Porter? I think there's a big maybe there. There's a high potential for that. I mean, Adrian Broner kind of had a flash knockdown on Shawn Porter in the last round of their fight, a fight that Porter was clearly winning, but he got dropped once against Broner. Got up, and again, he finishes all the fights that he's in. I think he's going to finish this fight. I don't think Terence Crawford's going to stop Shawn Porter. I think that this is going to be a case where we see with our eyes a fight that's either even or you could go either way with it. I think that, you know, you could possibly go, you know, Shawn Porter with it. But I'm a little worried about the judging. Now, I'm not going to get into the politics into why it would actually benefit PBC to kind of screw around with Terence Crawford with the judging. I mean, if this is Crawford's last fight with Top Rank and then he ends up wanting to come over to PBC, is he better off coming over to PBC with a win over Shawn Porter or a loss to Shawn Porter? Is it better if he comes with the belt or with no belt? We're not going to have to get into all that. I just think that we're going to see when these guys get in the ring an even fight or something that even slightly favors Shawn Porter. The question is, are the judges going to see it the same? So my prediction here, I'm going to pick a very unpopular pick here. I'm actually going to go with a draw. I think that I'm going to see Shawn Porter beat Terence Crawford, but I think that the judging's going to get weird. Terence Crawford's going to hold on to his belt, and they're going to actually declare it like a split draw or something like that. Look, of course, the chances of a draw happening are slim. Like, that's one of those where if you are going to put your money down in Vegas and bet on a draw, it's one of those high-risk, high-reward bets. But I'm going to go with that one right here. I think that it's not the most likely scenario, but it's the one I'm going to go with because I think that the fair call, based on what I think I'm going to see in there, would be a 115-113 split decision type win for Shawn Porter. I just don't think we're going to get there judging-wise. I'm going to go with the draw. Terence Crawford versus Shawn Porter. Again, the wild cards here are a Terence Crawford stoppage over Shawn Porter or a couple knockdowns of Shawn Porter for Terence Crawford. But yeah, let me know what you think about this magnificent fight. This is a delight to have this on the schedule. Terence Crawford versus Shawn Porter. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.